Today's story is one of Hollywood's darkest tragedies. A promising actor who rode the wave of fame on Sons of Anarchy, only to crash into unimaginable violence and death. This is the chilling true story of ambition gone horribly wrong, of a system that failed to intervene, and of one act of compassion that ended in tragedy. Ready to dive into the full heartbreaking details? Here's how it all began. In the sprawling landscape of Los Angeles, where millions come to chase dreams, there are countless faces hoping to make it. Johnny Lewis was one of them. Born in Hart, Michigan in 1983, he grew up in a small town where dreams felt like luxuries reserved for people somewhere else. But Johnny Lewis had something that small towns rarely produce: ambition. As a young man, he packed his life into a car and drove west, like so many others before him. Los Angeles welcomed him with open arms and closed doors. The struggle was real. The competition was ruthless. But Johnny Lewis had the one thing casting directors said they needed: a memorable face. Dark, intense, brooding. The kind of face that could play a criminal, a dangerous man, someone lurking on the edge of society. He started small, the way all actors do. Guest appearances on television shows, minor roles that kept him afloat. He worked odd jobs to pay rent. He attended acting classes. He auditioned constantly. The rejection was relentless, but he kept pushing. That determination, that hunger, that refusal to accept defeat, it would define him. For a while, it would be his greatest strength. Eventually, it would become his greatest weakness. By his late 20s, Lewis had built a modest resume. He'd appeared in shows like Gilmore Girls, CSI, and various other television programs. He was building credibility, making connections, and slowly climbing the ladder that every actor in Hollywood dreams of ascending. He was one of thousands, but he believed he was destined for more. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. In 2008, Johnny Lewis auditioned for Sons of Anarchy, a new television series created by Kurt Sutter. The show was about motorcycle clubs, loyalty, violence, and the complex morality of men living outside the law. It was edgy, raw, and unlike anything else on television. Lewis landed the role of Drew Sidwell, a prospect in the motorcycle club. It wasn't the lead role. Charlie Hunnam played Jax Teller, the main character, but it was a recurring part in what would become one of the most popular shows on cable television. For Johnny Lewis, it was the break he'd been waiting for. The show premiered in September 2008, and it was an immediate success. Critics praised it, audiences loved it, and suddenly, Johnny Lewis was part of something big. He was walking red carpets, he was recognized on the street, he was getting callbacks for other roles. The dream was becoming real. Sons of Anarchy became a cultural phenomenon. It ran for 7 seasons, from 2008 to 2014, and amassed millions of devoted fans around the world. For someone like Johnny Lewis, being part of that success was intoxicating. This was what he'd driven to Los Angeles for. This was what he'd sacrificed for. This was his moment. But moments are fragile things in Hollywood. For 3 years, Lewis was part of the show's success. He appeared in episodes, built his character, and became a familiar face to millions of viewers. He was finally making real money. He was getting better roles in other projects. He was meeting important people in the industry. Everything seemed to be on an upward trajectory. Then, in 2012, something happened that would begin to unravel the carefully constructed fabric of his life. In 2012, Johnny Lewis was fired from Sons of Anarchy. The reason was shocking and troubling. He had stolen a motorcycle, not a prop motorcycle used on set, an actual motorcycle taken without permission. It wasn't a random act of teenage rebellion. It wasn't a practical joke that went too far. It was theft. It was reckless. It was the kind of behavior that suggested something was fundamentally wrong. Kurt Sutter, the show's creator, discovered the theft and made the decision to fire Lewis immediately. There was no second chance. There was no discussion about rehabilitation or another opportunity. He was gone. For an actor in Hollywood, a firing like that is devastating. It's not just the loss of a job or a paycheck. It's the message it sends to every other producer, director, and studio executive in the industry. This person is unreliable. This person is a problem.
This person cannot be trusted. Word travels fast in Hollywood. What you do on one set becomes known on every set. Johnny Lewis's reputation was damaged in a way that felt catastrophic to him. The trajectory that had been climbing upward suddenly reversed direction. But the firing from Sons of Anarchy was more than just a career setback. It was a symptom of something deeper. Looking back at it now, with the benefit of hindsight and the knowledge of what came later, the motorcycle theft appears not as an isolated incident, but as one of the first visible cracks in a deteriorating mental and emotional state. Around this same time, those close to Lewis began to notice changes. He was becoming increasingly erratic. His behavior was unpredictable. He would disappear for days without explanation. When he reappeared, he seemed different, wired, agitated, paranoid. Friends tried to reach out. Family members expressed concern. But Johnny Lewis was resistant to help. He was resistant to any suggestion that something might be wrong with him. What nobody knew at this moment was that Lewis was
beginning to struggle with substance abuse. It started, like it often does, with recreational use. A bit of cocaine at a party, methamphetamine with friends. It was supposed to be occasional, fun, something to take the edge off the disappointment and rejection he was feeling. But addiction doesn't work on a schedule. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't respond to promises to stop. Once it has its hooks in you, it pulls you deeper, and the depths go much, much further than most people realize when they first start using. By 2013, Johnny Lewis was spiraling. The man who had been a working actor, who had appeared on a major television show, who had seemed to be on the verge of a successful career, that man was being replaced by someone unrecognizable. The substances coursed through his system, altering his brain chemistry, affecting his judgment, his impulse control, his ability to connect with reality in any meaningful way. In 2014, Johnny Lewis's inner chaos began to spill onto social media. Twitter became his confessional, his warning system, his desperate cry for help that only sounded like dangerous ranting to those reading it. He posted increasingly bizarre and paranoid messages. He talked about being watched. He talked about government conspiracies. He wrote about threats that only existed in the fractured landscape of his drugged mind. He posted cryptic messages that seemed to suggest violent thoughts. Some posts referenced suicide. Others seemed to suggest harm to others. The posts were disturbing to those who knew him or followed him. Some of his followers tried to reach out, to express concern. Most people just watched from a distance, unsure if this was real mental illness, performance art, or the desperate attention-seeking of a fading actor trying to stay relevant.
What it actually was? A man in free fall, spiraling deeper into mental illness and substance abuse, desperately trying to communicate that he was in trouble while being incapable of actually communicating it clearly. During this period, Lewis also became increasingly hostile and aggressive in person. There were reports of strange behavior, confrontations with people in public, moments of sudden rage that seemed to come out of nowhere. He was like a bomb with a faulty timer. You never knew when he would explode, and neither did he. Works dried up completely. No roles came, no callbacks, no opportunities. The industry had written him off. He was toxic, he was unstable, he was not worth the risk. From being a working actor in a hit television show to being completely unemployable took just a few years. Mental health professionals might have recognized the signs by this point: paranoia, erratic behavior, substance abuse, disconnection from reality. These are serious indicators that someone needs intervention. They need treatment, they need help. But Johnny Lewis didn't have anyone intervening. He didn't have family nearby. He didn't have close friends willing to force the issue. He had acquaintances, some former co-stars who might have felt uncomfortable reaching out, and a lot of people watching from a distance as he self-destructed. By 2015, Johnny Lewis was essentially homeless. He moved from place to place, staying with people who didn't know him well, who didn't understand the extent of his crisis, or who simply didn't care enough to get involved. He was nearly invisible, just another lost person in a city full of lost people. He was barely sleeping. Sleep deprivation combined with drug use creates a particular kind of psychosis. Your brain stops being able to distinguish between what's real and what's imagined. Paranoia intensifies.
Aggression increases. You become increasingly unpredictable and dangerous, often without being aware of how unstable you've become. Lewis looked like a shell of himself by this point. The handsome young actor with dark, intense eyes and a promising career had been replaced by someone gaunt, hollow-eyed, weathered by drugs and mental illness. People who saw him would look away quickly, uncomfortable with what they were seeing. By September 2015, Lewis had been staying at the home of Catherine Davis, a woman who knew his family and was trying to help him by offering shelter. Catherine was 68 years old, a grandmother, a woman with a good heart who believed in giving people second chances. She had no idea how dangerous her houseguest had become. During this time, Lewis was not sleeping. He was using heavily. He was paranoid. He was aggressive. He was living in a realm of delusion where his mind had created threats and enemies that didn't exist. On September 25, 2015, in the evening, Catherine Davis tried to have a conversation with Johnny Lewis about his behavior, about his state of mind, about the fact that she was concerned for his well-being. It was an act of kindness, an attempt to reach someone she could see was drowning. But Johnny Lewis couldn't hear kindness anymore. His mind couldn't interpret it correctly. Whatever was happening in his fractured consciousness, Catherine Davis's concern was transformed into something threatening, something dangerous, something that, in his mind, justified a response. The morning of September 26, 2015 dawned like any other morning in the residential hills of Los Angeles. The sun rose. People prepared for their Saturday. No one knew that within hours, a tragedy would unfold that would leave multiple victims, end one life by violence,
and end another by suicide. Johnny Lewis woke up, if you could call his state of consciousness waking. He had barely slept. The substances in his system, combined with his untreated mental illness, created a perfect storm of rage, delusion, and violent impulse. Something in him had finally broken completely. The attack on Catherine Davis was not a sudden moment of passion or a temporary loss of control. It was sustained, brutal, savage, and escalating. Lewis attacked the 68-year-old woman with shocking violence. He punched her, he beat her. As she fought back, desperately trying to survive, trying to get away, Lewis's rage did not diminish, it intensified. Catherine Davis was 68 years old. She was trying to help a young man she believed was in trouble. She had no defense against the full force of a man in the grip of complete psychosis and substance-fueled rage. During the assault, Lewis threw Catherine Davis from a second-story window. She fell onto the ground below. But her ordeal was not finished. When her 12-year-old son heard the commotion from the other part of the house and came to investigate what was happening to his mother, he encountered Johnny Lewis. Without hesitation, without mercy, Lewis turned his violence onto the child. The boy was beaten savagely. He was left bleeding and dying on the floor. Two victims, a grandmother and a grandchild, both attacked with extreme violence by a man who was supposed to be a houseguest, receiving shelter and kindness. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is what came next. After committing these acts of violence, Johnny Lewis seemed to return partially to reality. The magnitude of what he had done was beginning to register. The horror of his actions was becoming unavoidable. He left the house and began wandering the neighborhood.
Seemingly in a daze, he was confused. He appeared to some who saw him to be disoriented, as if waking from a nightmare to find that the nightmare was real. Neighbors noticed him. Some were frightened. Some called police. Authorities began to respond to reports of a disturbed, dangerous individual in the area. When police arrived at the scene, they found Catherine Davis dead. They found her 12-year-old son severely injured but alive. And they found Johnny Lewis, the actor from Sons of Anarchy, at the center of a crime scene that was almost too brutal to comprehend. Lewis was not cooperative. He was still in a state of agitation and confusion. As officers approached to apprehend him, he resisted violently. The man who played a criminal on television was now truly a criminal in reality. But unlike the scripted versions, there would be no redemption arc, no comeuppance that came with the safety of knowing it was fiction. As police moved toward him, Johnny Lewis made his final choice. He ran to the roof of a nearby building. Police moved to stop him, but he was driven by something beyond reason, beyond self-preservation. He jumped. The fall was approximately 40 feet. It was not survivable. Johnny Lewis was pronounced dead at the scene. Suicide, the ultimate escape, the final rejection. The end of a tragedy that began not with the violence, but years earlier with broken dreams, untreated mental illness, substance abuse that went completely unchecked, and a system that failed to intervene until it was far, far too late. The actor who had walked onto the set of Sons of Anarchy with ambition and hope was now just another statistic, a tragic figure who became a perpetrator of unspeakable violence and who ended his life by his own hand rather than face the
consequences. Catherine Davis was dead. She was 68 years old. She was remembered by friends and family as a kind woman, someone who believed in helping people, someone who saw potential for redemption in others. Her only crime was trying to help a struggling young man who appeared to be in distress. Her 12-year-old grandson survived the assault, but survival does not mean healing. The physical injuries would heal. The psychological scars would not. A child had witnessed unimaginable violence. A child had nearly died at the hands of an adult who was supposed to be a guest in their home. A child had his innocence stolen and replaced with trauma that would shape the rest of his life. The family of Catherine Davis was destroyed. There is no other word for it. The grandmother was gone. The grandson was traumatized. The entire family structure was shattered. When the story broke in the media, it sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Sons of Anarchy fans were stunned. They remembered Johnny Lewis as a regular presence in the show. They had watched him as a character on screen. Now they learned that he had become a murderer in real life. The narrative was complicated and uncomfortable. He was both a victim of mental illness, of substance abuse, of a system that failed him, and a perpetrator of horrific violence. He was both the tragic figure destroyed by the cruelties of fame and rejection, and a brutal killer who took an innocent life. Hollywood released statements of condolences. The television industry moved on. The show that had featured him continued without him. People watched and they forgot about Johnny Lewis, or tried to. But Catherine Davis's family never forgot, never moved on, never fully recovered from what happened on September 26, 2015.
The story of Johnny Lewis forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our society, our mental health systems, our responsibility to people in crisis, and the price of broken dreams. Could intervention have changed the outcome? If someone in Lewis's life had recognized the signs earlier, the substance abuse, the paranoia, the erratic behavior, the social media posts growing increasingly disturbing, could forced treatment have prevented what happened? Could medication, therapy, and structure have saved Catherine Davis's life? These are impossible questions to answer with certainty, but they haunt us because we suspect the answer is yes, or at least maybe. Where were the systems designed to catch people like Johnny Lewis before they fall? Hollywood is a town built on dreams and built on rejection. Everyone fails. Everyone faces rejection and disappointment. But most people don't descend into complete psychosis and violence. Why? Because they have family close by, or friends who intervene, or access to mental health care, or some combination of protective factors that Johnny Lewis lacked. Could the entertainment industry have done more? When he was fired from Sons of Anarchy, could there have been an attempt to encourage him toward treatment rather than just cast him off as toxic and unemployable? When his social media posts were becoming increasingly disturbing, could someone have reported him to authorities for a psychiatric evaluation? These are the uncomfortable questions that arise after tragedies like this, and they have no clean answers. What we do know is this: Johnny Lewis was a person struggling with serious mental illness and substance abuse. He reached out on social media, sending distress signals that most of us missed or misinterpreted. He was not receiving treatment, was not connected to services that could have helped him. He was increasingly isolated and disconnected from reality. And then he murdered someone. And then he killed himself. 2 lives destroyed, a child traumatized, a family devastated, and a man who could have been saved reduced to a cautionary tale.
We tell the story of Johnny Lewis as a story of a celebrity who fell from grace, but it's also the story of Catherine Davis, who opened her home to someone in need and paid the ultimate price. It's the story of a 12-year-old child who survived an assault he should never have had to experience. These are the stories that matter most, even though they receive less attention than the story of the actor. We tell the story of Johnny Lewis as if it's unique or unusual, but the truth is far more troubling. There are thousands of Johnny Lewises in America, people struggling with untreated mental illness and substance abuse, living on the streets or in precarious housing situations, becoming increasingly disconnected from reality, representing danger to themselves and others, and receiving no intervention until it's catastrophically too late. The difference with Johnny Lewis is that he had once been famous. He had once had opportunities and potential. We could look at his career and see how far he had fallen. That contrast makes his story compelling. But the underlying tragedy, mental illness, substance abuse, lack of intervention, is replayed thousands of times a year in cities across America with people who were never famous at all. Johnny Lewis's story is both unique because of who he was and depressingly common because of what happened to him. When people discuss his case now, some focus on the violence he committed, some focus on the mental illness that preceded it, some focus on the celebrity aspect. But perhaps the most important focus should be on the question his case raises. What is our responsibility to people who are spiraling into crisis? When do we intervene? When do we push for treatment? When do we decide that someone's freedom is less important than their safety and the safety of those around them? These are not easy questions, and Johnny Lewis's case doesn't provide easy answers, but it does provide a tragic, real-world example of what happens when we fail to ask these questions until it's far too late.